Here in Australia, as I record this video, we're starting to come back to normal life. All of the states have opened their borders and it's now possible for all of us to just go from one state to the other unrestrictedly. Although this is great news, we still have a sense that border closures can happen again. And worse, we know that it can be fast, it can take us off guard. It's on that note that today we're talking about the interstate freedom of intercourse, but in terms of the border closures, Australian Federation and the COVID pandemic. Hello everyone, my name is Renato Costa, this is Aussie Law, and today we will talk about the constitutionality of the state's border closures. I should start this video by saying something that you already know, but I think it's still worth mentioning. I'm not here trying to defend or criticize the decisions that have been made, the restrictions that have been imposed. This is not my role here. Like all of my videos, this is a technical description of what the judiciary says, what legal scholarship says, or even what the Constitution says about the closure of the borders. In this video, I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about the constitutionality, the legality, the lawfulness of the states closing their own borders and preventing members from other states from entering in their own territory. So to show me some support in this endeavor, I really hope that you can click the like button and subscribe to our channel as well. Okay, there are some questions that will help us understand this topic. 1. Do states have the power to close their borders? 2. If the states have the power, does the Constitution limit that power somehow? And 3. How can the Australian federal system survive after the states closing their borders? The idea is to show that if states did it, they must have the power to do it. But if the power exists, there might be a limitation on that power, and that if the power is exercised, there are some consequences to it. So let's start with the first question. Does the Australian Constitution give the power to the states to close their own borders? No, that's the simple answer. It doesn't. But we have to remember something about the Australian federal system. The Constitution was the result of an aggregation of the former colonies, the states, and therefore it guarantees the continuity of states' powers and laws. We have discussed a little bit about this when we refer to the doctrine of the reserved powers, but also I've mentioned it in other videos that sections 106, 107 and 108 also guarantee the continuity of the state's laws. The big picture is that the states have these plenary legislative powers, the possibility of legislating about virtually anything, and the Commonwealth has only specific, limited powers. The powers of the Commonwealth are expressed in the Constitution, and they can be exclusive or concurrent powers. When the Constitution is silent, then we presume that those powers belong to the states. Health is a good example here, because each state will legislate about matters relating to health. So when it comes to a virus pandemic, we would assume that the states would have the power to legislate about that. So one may be wondering, do states have the specific powers to close their borders then? Well, yes. It's not necessarily expressed, but yes. If they find justification for it, the closure of the borders can actually be a lawful measure to either prohibit, avoid something, or also promote a certain good. So if we think of the history and the conception of the Federation, I think we managed to answer the first question. States do have the power to close their borders. The power is constitutional, even though it's not expressed in the Australian Constitution. I was trying to be really careful when I said that the states had the power to close the borders, because to do that, they need to justify it. Even though the Constitution doesn't expressly give that power, the Constitution does impose some limits on that power. A clear example is Section 92 of the Australian Constitution, where it guarantees that interstate intercourse shall be absolutely free. We've seen that the absolute free expression conveys exactly what it should. Intercourse should be as free as possible. And that's the rule. Normally, under ordinary circumstances, everyone is free to move around Australia. You can go to the states and leave the states as you want. In extraordinary circumstances, however, that freedom can be limited. This was the nub of the decision in Palma and Western Australia, wasn't it? The COVID pandemic was an unprecedented crisis because there were no vaccines, no previous knowledge about the virus, no certainty about death dose or the contagiousness of the virus. It became clear that states could actually exercise some extraordinary powers to make sure that that disease was not going to spread any longer. So they could exercise, in these extraordinary circumstances, this extraordinary power to close the borders. The issue brought by Palmer before the High Court of Australia was precisely this: could states lawfully close their borders? And the answer that the High Court gave was yes, as long as it is reasonably justifiable or proportionate to the scope, to the ends that the states aimed at achieving. That's a limit on the power of the states to close their borders. Again, maybe if now someone challenged the decision of a particular state to close their borders in this new condition that we're living under, where we have more than 90% of Australians vaxxed, where the international borders are open, and also that we have a better understanding of the virus itself, maybe a decision to close the borders could be potentially unconstitutional. I can't predict it, but it's possible. The states do have the power can be exercised, but the power is not unlimited. And Section 92 is also not the only limit that the Constitution imposes. The Australian Constitution also has a provision that prevents discrimination against Australian citizens if they reside in another state. This has been argued to be another limit that the Constitution imposes on the closure of borders. By the way, that provision that I mentioned is Section 117 of the Australian Constitution. Make sure you subscribe to my channel because my next video will tell you everything that you need to know about that section. So I think we've answered question number 2. The power exists, but there are some constitutional limits that will be imposed on the exercise of that power. According to the recent decision of the High Court though, the imposition of these limits on the powers that states have to close their borders will be analyzed in a case-by-case basis. And states can only close the borders if the measures are reasonably necessary for the achievement of the constitutionally prescribed aim that the states aim at achieving. Finally, the last question is, what now? What changes in the Australian Federation with the possibility of states closing their borders? Honestly, not much. Remember, this has already happened before with the Spanish flu, and it can happen again. The structure of the Federation, the distribution of powers between Commonwealth and states, these have not been altered. It's true that one can say that society will never be the same, or that states have regained the primacy in the Federation. That this has shown that the principle of subsidiarity and giving too much power to the Commonwealth in detriment of the states is a bad idea. And to a certain degree, I think that there's merit to these affirmations, but again, legally speaking, nothing changed. The Australian federal system continues. I think this is the kind of analysis that maybe in years in advance we can make, because right now we're still living through it. We're still to see the effects of these decisions. It's impossible to predict the future and to know precisely what will be the effects to the Australian Federation of the decision that states made to close the borders. And since we are talking about the future, I can't predict that I'll see you again, but I certainly hope to do so. Until then, ciao.